Hello, everybody. My name is Will Carter. I'm the Deputy Director of the Tech Policy Program. And on behalf of myself and my co-author on this report, Jen Daskal, right here to my left, we want to thank you all for coming today and thank the many of you in the audience and on the panel who contributed very much to this report. We are here today to launch our report, Low-Hanging Fruit, Digital Evidence, Evidence-Based Solutions to the Digital Evidence Challenge. And this report is the product of more than a year of work, really honestly 3 years of work that CSIS has been doing on digital evidence issues and law enforcement and technology issues. When we concluded our study on encryption last year, one of the takeaways from that project was that the issues facing law enforcement are just so broad and so complex, and we thought that there were many more facets to delve into. And we also recognized that there's far less data about this out there than we would like and that we think is necessary to do informed policy making, and so we wanted to address both of those challenges. So over the past year, we conducted a series of interviews, roundtables, and we also commissioned a survey of federal, state, and local law enforcement across the country from a professional survey firm, trying to better understand these issues and get firsthand perspectives, not just from law enforcement, but also from service providers, the civil society community, the legal community, about the full range of challenges that law enforcement is dealing with in accessing and utilizing digital evidence. We ended up identifying 4 broad categories of issues that we addressed in this report. First and foremost is the difficult relationship between service providers and law enforcement. Law enforcement has actually submitted more than 130,000 requests for digital evidence to just 6 major service providers in the last year. That's up 60% from 2014. And it turns out that more than 50% of our survey respondents identified issues with working with service providers as the #1 challenge they deal with in utilizing digital evidence. Whether it's knowing what data is available from service providers, which service providers have it, or knowing how to serve process on those service providers in order to get the evidence that they need. This ranks significantly higher than a range of other challenges that we asked about, including accessing data from devices, making use of or analyzing evidence once it's collected, using it in court. The second bucket of issues is resources. In looking at this problem, at first it seemed that there was a wide range of programs, centers, organizations that were dedicated to helping law enforcement deal with digital evidence. But as we drilled down, we realized that the funding for those programs is pretty slim, that the staffing available is limited, and often the people who are dedicating their time and energy to this and who are really the experts on these issues are doing it as a side function while they have day jobs, whether it's people at the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section of the Department of Justice or some of the experts at some of the major state police agencies who have deep experience working on issues with getting data from service providers. In fact, the only entity in the government with the dedicated mission of facilitating a better relationship between service providers and law enforcement, the National Domestic Communications Assistance Center, NDCAC, fun acronym, their budget is just $11.4 million, which they are supposed to use to support the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States on a type of evidence and a category of investigations that is affecting virtually every case nowadays. To put that in perspective, that's less than $1,000 per law enforcement agency that they're supposed to support. The third bucket of issues is training. And this is something that came up frequently and early in our study. It turns out that law enforcement agents receive on average just 10 to 16 hours of digital evidence training in a year, and almost 50% of law enforcement officers that responded to our survey received digital evidence training every 2 years or less. That's a tiny amount relative to other forms of training, and given the complexity of these issues, the number of service providers, the amount of data, the number of investigations affected, just struck us as much too small. And while there are a number of great training centers across the country working on a wide range of issues, we found that training is inconsistent. The focus varies a lot from program to program, and also that the scope of issues that law enforcement needs to deal with were not adequately addressed. So one of the big issues that came out of our study was training programs across the country are overwhelmingly focused on devices and digital forensics, with a lot less focus on accessing data from service providers and utilizing data once it's collected. Finally, there were a range of legal and policy challenges that arose from our study. And a lot of them seem to tie back to the fact that law enforcement is doing digital investigations using largely pre-digital authorities. If you look at the statutory basis for most digital evidence investigations, the really big pieces are the Stored Communications Act from 1986, when the internet was definitely nothing like the internet of today, and the Fourth Amendment from 1791, at which point I don't think they contemplated an internet or anything digital, and even electricity was a thing of the future. As a result of that, the authorities that law enforcement is using were not designed for this task, and they're not entirely well suited. There is no mechanism for verifying the identities of law enforcement, requesting data from service providers. Utilizing evidence in court can be difficult, requiring both law enforcement and the service providers to testify to the authenticity of the evidence and the validity of the chain of custody. And there are no minimization, security, or transparency and reporting requirements for SCA collection, which differs significantly from, for example, the Wiretap Act, which has extensive reporting requirements because it was viewed as an authority that had the potential to be very intrusive, to collect a huge amount of data on the private lives of Americans. But the good news is these problems can be solved, and we actually think that they can be solved in ways that will appeal to everyone, will both strengthen law enforcement's ability to do its job and strengthen privacy and civil liberties, and can be done at relatively low cost. But it won't be easy. It'll require action from the law enforcement community, but it'll also require action from Congress and very much from the service providers. Our report primarily calls for a new national digital evidence policy. This is a strategic vision of how we want to utilize digital evidence, the resources, the authorities, the capabilities that are out there. It is going to require a dedicated office that can focus its attention on these issues, can evolve as technology evolves, as law enforcement evolves, and as law enforcement's needs change, and that can also provide a wide range of important functions to facilitate the use of this type of evidence, working with law enforcement to identify the most pressing challenges over time, facilitating improved cooperation with service providers, disseminating knowledge and analytical tools throughout the law enforcement community, and also promoting transparency and accountability and keeping the eye on civil liberties and the protection of individual privacy. We also call for law enforcement to make better use of some of the resources that are available, utilizing law enforcement guidance put out by companies, utilizing the many centers of excellence across the country, finding ways to provide more access to these training programs, many of which are actually highly effective, and tailoring requests as much as possible. Law enforcement reported, and we found in our study that there can be a bit of a catch-22 in requesting data from companies. Law enforcement often doesn't know exactly what the companies have, how they label it, how to request it, so they make broad requests and use whatever comes back. But that makes things more difficult for them because they often get data they don't need or don't get the data that they want, and it makes things more difficult for the companies who feel that these requests are overbroad. Finally, service providers. They have to be a part of the solution here, and we think that there are a number of things that providers can and should do to build on the many efforts that are already underway. Increasing staffing and resources to meet these requests and to be more responsive. Importantly, it's not just a question of staffing. There are many types of tooling and other types of resources that can be dedicated to this problem, and we think that can be really important. But also just providing greater transparency to law enforcement about what they have, about their internal policies and practices, about why they reject requests, and improving the communication and the relationship across the board. All this together is what we call the low-hanging fruit. It's a wide array of easy to implement solutions. We estimated that even a reasonably thorough iteration of the National Digital Evidence Policy could be executed for less than $100 million, which I know it sounds like a lot of money, but to anyone on the congressional side who's sat in on appropriations, they know that, it's not a lot of money for the federal government. But it's also something that can be done to improve law enforcement's ability to do their jobs and to address the needs of service providers and the civil society community, even while we continue to have debates around issues like encryption and ephemerality. Those debates are going to go on, and they are important issues, but we think that there is a lot that can be done in the meantime. There's a lot of room for cooperation between all of these different groups, and that is beneficial to everyone and to the American people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful panelists. We are really lucky to have this group here today, and to my co-author, Jen Daskal. But before I do, I just want to give one last round of thanks. So I want to thank first all of the members of federal, state, and local law enforcement who took the time to sit down and engage with us, to give us their firsthand perspectives, to provide us with data, and without whom we could not have done this report, and it would not have been remotely useful or valuable. So thank you all. Thank you also to the service providers who came in, took the time to sit down, explain to us how things look from their side of the fence, discuss what is feasible, what is possible, and many of whom are voluntarily committing to adopting many of the recommendations in this report in order to facilitate a better relationship. Thank you also to our team, particularly to William Crumpler, our indefatigable RA, who took on a whole bunch of really, really annoying and difficult data collection and analysis challenges for this report. And anyone in the audience who has tried to consolidate all of the transparency reports from the tech companies should appreciate the amount of work that went into this project. So thank you also to William. And finally, I want to thank our panelists and also Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for joining us for the event today. Thank you for all of you for being here today, and we're looking forward to a great discussion.
Great. So I want to reiterate the thanks and launch what I think will be a really exciting panel discussion. We have an amazing group of panelists here today. So I'm going to do very brief intros. You can look them all up. They're all stellar, but I don't want to waste a lot of time doing on intros. So at my far right, your left, is David KRIS. He's the founder of a company called Culper Partners, LLC. He was previously the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at DOJ, and before that held many other high-level positions at DOJ, was the General Counsel at Intellectual Ventures, and Deputy General Counsel and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Time Warner. Most importantly, he was my boss when I worked at DOJ. To his left, and to your right, is Jane HORVATH, who's the Senior Director of Global Privacy at Apple, where she's been since September of 2001. She's responsible for overseeing Apple's global compliance with privacy laws and working both externally and internally on privacy-related issues. And she also has experience at DOJ. She was DOJ's very first Privacy Counsel and Civil Liberties Officer. To her left, on your right, is David BITKOWER, who's a partner at Jenner & Block. He spent more than a decade as a federal prosecutor, including most recently as Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division at DOJ. And our sons play on a soccer team together. To his left, we have Michael SACHS, who made the trip from New York. Thank you. He's an Executive Assistant District Attorney and Chief of the Investigation Division at the New York County DA's office. He's been there since 2015, and he's responsible for supervising a number of different offices and units within that office, including the Counterterrorism Program, the Asset Forfeiture Unit, the Cybercrime and Identity Theft Bureau, and he assists the DA with a number of major initiatives, including the Global Cyber Alliance. In 2011, Mr. SACHS was named the Prosecutor of the Year by the New York Metro chapter of the International Association of Financial Crimes Investigators. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Ethan Aronson, who's the Senior Legal Director of Law Enforcement at Safety at Oath. He also has former experience at DOJ. He spent many years in the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Division at CSIS. He also spent some time on the Hill working for Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. And he, as a prosecutor, prosecuted many data breaches and other computer intrusions and supervised a number of attorneys as well. He, too, is an awardee. He won the 2015 AG's Award for Distinguished Service and the 2013 FBI Director's Award. So as you can see, not a shabby panel. So I'm just to reiterate something that Will mentioned, this report was designed explicitly to look at the range of challenges that law enforcement faces in accessing digital evidence separate and apart from the encryption issues. There's been a lot of national attention to the encryption issues, a lot of national attention to the questions about ephemerality of data. And our focus here was to look at all of the other things that also affect and hinder and cause challenges for law enforcement in their ability to use digital evidence. We think that these are important issues no matter what happens with respect to those other ongoing debates, which we recognize are important and will need to continue. But in the meantime, we think that there's a lot that can and should be done to facilitate law enforcement access to digital evidence as those debates continue. So I'm going to turn first to David BITKOWER, who was extremely helpful to us in producing this report. He participated and helped with gathering some of the federal, state, and local law enforcement officials and participated as a moderator in some of the discussions. So I'm going to turn to David first and ask him to describe, if he can, what he thinks are some of the biggest challenges that he both encountered, that you encountered personally, and that you heard about in some of these discussions.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jen. Thanks, Will, for having us here, and it's a pleasure to participate in this panel, and I think it's a hugely important issue, and so I'm grateful that you guys are doing the work on this and have assembled these other experts to talk about it. So I encountered challenges with digital evidence in a couple of different roles in my career at the Justice Department. So both as a frontline prosecutor, as an assistant U.S. attorney, doing cases that ranged from gang prosecutions and firearms cases up through complex fraud cases. And then in the second half of my career at DOJ, when I was in the front office of the criminal division, which covers a wide range of criminal activity, but also covers policy issues. And just in the decade plus that I worked at the Justice Department, I saw a major change in the role that digital evidence plays. Starting from when I was doing firearm possession cases and going up to when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office and was doing national security cases, even in that 5 to 7 year period of time, you saw the increasing prevalence of digital evidence in every kind of case. So even in the simple cases, did someone possess a firearm, you would see it went from straightforward police evidence and police testimony being the crucial evidence to pictures on social media or on someone's cell phone showing them possessing a particular firearm and rebutting a claim that they didn't actually possess it. In white-collar cases, you saw an evolution from forensic accounting solely and inferences about state of mind and testimony from cooperating witnesses to cases that relied increasingly and almost exclusively now on digital evidence to establish state of mind and the like. And it goes without saying in national security cases, which is what I wound up concentrating on at the U.S. Attorney's Office, you saw cases go again from witness testimony and forensic evidence to very complex analyses of digital evidence to establish relationships and connections and motivations. When I came to the criminal division and here at Maine Justice and had the pleasure of working with folks in the computer crime and intellectual property section, including Ethan, who's on the panel today, and the child exploitation section and the fraud section, the money laundering section, I saw it at a whole different level because here was where some of the most complicated cases, which were the most resource-intensive investigations, were handled. And you saw the higher order problems So not just how do you solve a particular case, how do you gather enough evidence to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody's guilty, but how do you address a dark web forum where you don't even know where it is, where you can watch a crime taking place in real time, but you can't say where the perpetrators are located, even though they are acting openly and notoriously on the internet, or cases involving botnets, where just understanding the technical operation of the computer system is essential to taking any law enforcement action, because otherwise the folks who are in charge of the botnet can shut down a vast array of computer systems. And so from the very basic at the federal level up to the most complex, understanding of digital evidence is frankly essential. You can't be a successful prosecutor and you can't be a successful agent in handling those crimes. And it takes me back, I'll be honest, to before I became a federal prosecutor, when I was a paralegal at the district attorney's office in Manhattan, where another panelist here is now the head of investigations. And that was, at the time, to be a successful technical prosecutor, you needed to basically know how to issue a subpoena to the telco providers to get subscriber information, and then use an Excel spreadsheet to sort that information. And that puts you at the top half, or maybe even higher, among the elite in terms of dealing with digital evidence. And the world we live in today is just a completely different world, and everybody, whether they're at the state level or the local level, whether out in the field, whether at a headquarters unit, whether an agent or whether they're a prosecutor, has to understand these issues and has to have the resources and capability to use them.
Great, thanks. So Michael, I just thought I would turn to you, and since you're here representing your experience in Manhattan, but also a representative of the state and local perspective, and if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you're seeing on the ground, both in your office and I know you're in regular conversation with a lot of other prosecutors and analysts as well.
Sure. Well, first, I will, being the only current government employee on here, I will give the government caveat always that my comments are my own. While I work for the district attorney's office, anything I say today are really going to be based on my own personal opinions. And certainly I do work with a number of state and local prosecutors, and there have been concerns going on a long time in our community about how we can get access to this information and how we can actually use this information. I will start by saying that these conversations, all of this is really, there's nothing new. I mean, honestly, this has been going back for decades, if you even want to start in the 90s, when CALIA came out, or the Clipper chip and all this other stuff. There's always been conversations about law enforcement access to data and how do we get it and how can we use it. The issue that we're seeing now, and I think is highlighted a little bit in the report, is that there seems to be a greater deal of animosity between some of the providers and some of the government. And one of the reasons why I'm here today is that I think it's important that we're part of this conversation. I think it's great that you were able to get the people from both sides sitting on this panel today. We don't always agree. We've read the report. There are certain parts of the report that I think are very good. There are certain parts that we take some issue with. But the important part is that there is a report and that there is a conversation and that we're sitting here today and talking about these issues. And so I think from the state and local perspective, one of our biggest issues right now, and I will start out by saying there's approximately 2,300 state and local prosecutors' offices across the country. The report mentions that about 95% of all violent crime is prosecuted by state and local prosecutors. I would go even further. It's about 95% of all crime across the United States is actually prosecuted by state and local prosecutors. So we are very much impacted by decisions from providers to be able to give us information about legal decisions, about what we can obtain, and so it is a problem for us. I will say, particularly in Manhattan, we've been very lucky because violent crime has been decreasing over the years, but while violent crime has been decreasing, cybercrime has been growing at an exponential rate, and particularly cybercrime that has a transnational nature to it, where you have individuals who are using U.S. companies not being located in the United States to commit fraud against citizens of the United States. For us, when we're trying to investigate those cases, really the most important thing is efficiency. How can we get access to that data? What is the data that's there? How long do you retain it? How do we get access to it in a timely manner? Because if we don't get it quickly, chances are that all leads that we would have to be able to actually prosecute those cases have now disappeared. And so certainly on the state and local side, there is a level of frustration about how we can actually get the data and how we can actually use the data. But again, not only getting it, but getting it in a timely manner so that we can follow up. And particularly in white-collar crime, we can try and actually claw back the proceeds of that criminal activity, reach out to other jurisdictions, see if there is video surveillance, see if there are financial records that we can actually go. And in order to actually get all of that information, it is very difficult. And frankly, that is probably the biggest issue that I see. The report focuses a lot on, I think, training. And again, as I pointed out, there's about 2,300 state and local prosecutors' offices. I think that's probably true. I think that training in certain offices definitely could be improved, particularly because technology is always evolving. And so sitting there and learning about what are the newest techniques, what is the information that's available, that is obviously something that's very important across the United States. However, it's going to vary depending upon what offices that you're particularly dealing with. My office is very fortunate. We are probably one of the best, if not the best, resourced offices in terms of not only training, but in staff, in working on these issues. We work very closely with a lot of other state and local prosecutors and also some federal agencies to help train other individuals on how to do this. As Jen pointed out, though, we also have day jobs in actually prosecuting the cases. And so increasing funding and helping in that area, I think, is certainly part of the solution. But from the state and local perspective, a bigger part is also improving our relationship with the providers and working out a standardization of the types of data that is available, the legal process in which we can use to obtain that data, and then response time so that we can get that data in a timely manner.
Great, thanks. David, Chris, I'm gonna turn to you now. If you, hoping you can elaborate on challenges that you've seen, and if there's anything in the report that kind of jumped out to you as a surprise.
Yeah, sure. Just riffing off Michael's comment that there's nothing new here, I was reminded when I was a young prosecutor in D.C., I had a case involving an assault in which the defendant cracked a bottle over the head of the victim while the victim was on the telephone with 911. And there was the sound of the bottle breaking, and then the defendant, who was somewhat intoxicated, took up the phone and had a long conversation with the 911 operator. I was able to get that audio tape introduced into evidence, and the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. And back then, you could talk to jurors after they had acquitted, so of course I went and asked them why. And they said to me, well, yeah, that audio tape was pretty persuasive, but proof beyond a reasonable doubt is a very high standard, and we would have felt a lot better about convicting had there been video. And I drew two lessons from that painful experience. First, I was not a very good trial lawyer, and that was for sure. And second, we really do need to focus on, electronic evidence of all kinds whenever we can. So it is not a new problem in the sense that at least jury expectations have been shaped, since Murder, She Wrote was broadcast. I think today, right now, we've seen a growing trend of dependence of government on providers and moving away from the old days of more self-help surveillance. And that's principally because you have to get the data from the providers. Packet switch networks make it very tough to intercept in the middle because the packets disperse and only converge at the end. And the profusion of providers and protocols and platforms also make it increasingly difficult for the government. So you see in some legal innovations like 702 of the FISA Amendments Act only applies when the government is collecting with the assistance of a provider. So it's clearly more and more important that the government be able to get the information from providers, and there's a greater interdependence between them. What jumped out at me about this report, and what I think commends it to all readers, is there actually is some low-hanging fruit that can be harvested here. I mean, like all of you, I've seen a million of these think tank reports, and typically they come and go fairly rapidly. They describe in great detail and admire the problem, and then they either leave it at that or they make up a solution that merely involves overruling Marbury versus Madison, and if we could just do that, everything would be fine. And that's why they have a very short shelf life. This report strikes me as genuinely different. There are a lot of very vexing, challenging problems here that won't get solved overnight, but there are, I think, and the report does a good job outlining them, a number of challenges that I think we could overcome with relatively modest financial outlays and relatively modest expenditures of time and energy. And that, to me, is the most impressive thing about this. And so we may not get to perfect, but we don't need to let the perfect become the enemy of the good.
Thank you. So Jane, I mean, the report talks about this, and you heard Michael talk about this, and you actually have heard all the panelists talk about this, to some extent, challenges that law enforcement perceives in working with service providers. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing from your end and ways that these challenges might be addressed.
Sure, and I want to thank Jen and Will for inviting me here today and commend the report. Like the other panelists, nothing in the report comes as a great surprise. There are 3 issues that I think really stand out to me. As a platform provider, we tend to get requests, and we see that law enforcement sometimes does not know where to go to find relevant evidence. So because we're a platform provider, we have apps on our devices. Sometimes we will get requests for other providers' data because there's a misunderstanding as to where the data is. So I think the report really points out that law enforcement needs to understand which providers to go to obtain relevant data. The second issue that I see is overbroad warrants. That the report draws our attention to, where you'll have a list of data and then you'll have and other relevant data. And from a team perspective, we only have a little bit of an idea of the case at hand. So it's very difficult for us to determine what might be other relevant data. And again, that points to a fundamental understanding is necessary for law enforcement, and I think training is very, very important, and my team has been doing training. It's very difficult, though. We're a very, very big country, and we actually train worldwide. So again, I think the report's suggestions on training are dead on. And then the last thing that I see as well is the dichotomy between federal and local law enforcement. We had one case in which local law enforcement obtained evidence, and it was a structured database file, and we provided the evidence to them, and we got a call probably a week later, and they were irate. They said, you know, this file is encrypted. We can't understand what's in this file at all. It's got all these letters and numbers. And we said, well, what did you do with it? And they said, well, we printed it. And it was a structured database file. So when you print a structured database file, it's very hard to understand. So we had to work with them to understand what was actually in the file. So to me, if we're looking at law enforcement officers, there has to be, I mean, digital evidence is probably the most important thing that they can be trained on now. The other thing that is important as far as training is, what do you do at the scene of a crime when there are mobile phones? What are the actions that you can take very quickly to preserve the evidence? And these are things that we've started training on, but we need more of a centralized place to do that training.
Great, thanks. So Ethan, I'm gonna turn to you because you've actually seen this from both sides now. Now you're at a private company, and before you spent many years in the government, and ask you to provide your perspective, but also specifically to maybe comment on something that Jane mentioned and that we talked about in our report, which is this question of the scope of requests was an issue that we heard a lot about in our conversations from both sides. We heard a lot of concerns from providers that requests were overbroad, and conversely from law enforcement that that law enforcement was making requests in the way that they were making requests because they wanted to be sure that they captured all of the relevant information, and that in many cases they were acting kind of in the dark and didn't know enough to ask more specifically the specific things that they wanted to ask for because they just didn't know enough. And so wanted to get your perspective, having seen this from both sides, and think through whether there's any way forward on this particular issue.
Thanks, Jen. So what I like about the report is that it really focuses on resources and the need for, especially state and local, to get more resources and have more help dealing with these very complicated issues. When I was at CSIS, I had the luxury of learning every single day. I was on the internet learning about the latest products. I was reading court opinions. I was, chasing botnets. These folks at state and local level are prosecuting murders and violent crimes on a daily basis and don't necessarily have the same luxury of time. So plussing up state and local resources, I think, is really important, and having a central resource for that matters. As to the concern about providers not being transparent, so the state and locals especially, but we hear this from the feds as well, that we don't know what data you have, and therefore we draft our warrants as broadly as we possibly can to try to capture everything it is that you have. That isn't a good model for a lot of reasons. Law enforcement response is a volume business. We get 11,000 requests a year from U.S. law enforcement alone at oath. So when we get extremely overbroad warrants, it really causes huge problems for the team. We generally have to communicate back to law enforcement and attempt to narrow those warrants. That takes time, and that delays every other warrant that we have to get to in that list of 11,000. I also think it's a little bit unusual to place this expectation on providers. So let's take this out of the cyber context for a minute. If the government was to call GE and say, hey, we're going to issue you a subpoena, we'd like you to list all the files that exist at the company, and we'll let you know which ones we're interested in, they probably wouldn't get a call back very quickly from GE. I think it is somewhat unusual for the government to expect that a provider would give a map to all of the data at the company. But that's not to say that that data is not available. So we have no secret products. We have products that are easily downloaded. In fact, most of them, in fact, the vast majority of them are free. We also publish privacy policies and terms of service that describe the information we collect and what we do with that information. So that data is available. It just takes legwork. It takes effort by investigators to read and learn about the company and its products. And I correlate this to a search of a residence. So if law enforcement is executing a search at a residence, there's a lot of work that goes into that search warrant, right? There is surveillance usually. A law enforcement officer will go out to the residence, will surveil it. There are pictures taken. There's a meeting that occurs where an ops plan is discussed. Officer safety concerns are addressed. There's a lot of work that goes into just a simple residential search warrant. If that same work was done to learn about the provider that the search warrant is being targeted to, I think you would get much more data in a much more efficient way.
Okay. So just one quick follow-up question. You've spoken a lot about warrants. I'm curious as to whether or not you're seeing what's perceived as a problem of overbreadth outside of, in other contexts, deorders and subpoenas as well.
I think the problem is primarily with warrants, although all forms of process are getting more complicated, and that's something that's not captured particularly well in transparency reports, because transparency reports are just about raw numbers. So how many requests came in the door and typically how many accounts were targeted. But what we're seeing is more than that. It's how many accounts are linked by IP address or by browser cookie. Those requests are much more complicated for us to handle. All the major providers are starting to address that now. But we're seeing much more complicated requests from law enforcement that take much more time for our teams to handle. And again, given this is a volume business, that creates real problems for us.
If I could just comment a moment. I think Jane made a good point when she was talking about providers are not often in a position to know the scope of the investigation. They're not often in a position to know what it is that government is looking for. And that is one of the big differences, as was just pointed out, in how search warrants are executed. It used to be that governments were the ones that were actually going and executing the search warrant. It's a lot easier when you're taking the door to go in and actually look through records and know which ones you were taking and which ones you might not want to take and things of that nature. The difficulty is that we have providers at times, and again, I'm not trying to paint this as a broad brush, because really there are very, very many social media providers out there, and some of them are really, really great to work with. Other ones are not so great to work with. And there are some companies out there that have very good transparency in terms of what data they have and what is available. And then there are other companies out there that literally it's a black hole. That you'll sit there and they'll tell you what they think you have, you'll subpoena that, you'll get a call from their legal staff saying that they don't have that information, and then we've had conversations before where we've then pointed them to their own transparency reports where they're saying, well, in fact, you do have this information, and it just turned out that the people that were handling the subpoena response actually were not aware of what the engineers had. We've had conversations with the engineers where we've gotten into specifically what we're looking for and why. And so again, there's no broad brush that applies to sort of all of this. One of the issues I think that state and locals, particularly, that we are somewhat sensitive about is when we're being told that something is overbroad, based on a lack of information that those providers actually might have. And for instance, we had an investigation that was fraud that predated, that actually started from September 11th and went until we actually were able to make an arrest in 2015. And so when we were requesting all of the content from social media providers pertaining to the investigation that we were doing, we were being told, well, it's overbroad because there's no way that whatever you're looking at can predate, it can go all the way back to when this account was created. Well, as a matter of fact, the fraud that we were investigating predated the creation of the social media company that we are actually trying to get data from. And so again, it's one of those issues that I feel like a conversation needs to be had, and sitting down and speaking with providers about what we're looking for. I think on both sides, there's a way to sort of work on some of this. And I do agree there are ways that we could possibly better tailor what it is, in fact, we are looking for, but it is also knowing that those companies are willing to engage with us and have those conversations.
Right. So that's a great segue, because it's one of the things that our report's recommendations really tries to address. Obviously, no set of recommendations are going to fully address the full scope of the problem, but we try to address it in a couple of different ways. One, by making recommendations and suggesting best practices to providers in terms of transparency about law enforcement guidance and facilitating information sharing. But also, and this addresses something that Jane pointed out, the challenges that providers face to some extent in providing training across 18,000 state and local offices across the country. And so one of the things that we are hopeful is that if and when a new National Digital Evidence Office were created and there was adequate resourcing and centralization of some of these efforts, it would provide a central place for providers to go to provide the information, and a central place for law enforcement to go to look for that information, which we would hope would alleviate. We recognize it's not going to fully solve the problem, but would go a long way towards addressing some of these concerns. So I want to now turn back to the panelists and get their comments on that, as well as the other recommendations in the report with respect to the creation of a National Digital Evidence Office. So go ahead, David.
Sure. I'm happy to go first. So I think, I think the one really important part of the report, to respond to Jen's question, is I think the report does have a section on legal authorities, but I think appropriately that's smaller compared to the other sections of the report. And it's very easy to focus on legal authorities versus practical realities because they're interesting, they're discrete, you don't need much data to talk about them, and you don't need to have any funding to address them. And so you often see in the debate, whether it's out in public, whether it's in congressional testimony or what have you, is a focus on changes to legal authority. And this is a timely panel because it comes, within a week of the department's digital cyber task force report, which focuses on a lot of these same issues, although with a different perspective. And one of the things that I think is valuable about this particular report here is that it focuses less on authorities and more on how do you take advantage of the authorities that currently exist. Not to say that there aren't important authorities issues out there, and some of them, in fact, are addressed here in the report, but there's so much that can be done in the frame of existing authorities if there were proper resources, training, knowledge, and cooperation among the parties. So that's an important point. And then in terms of, some of the comments from Jane and Ethan on the one hand and Michael on the other hand about how law enforcement interacts with providers, there's a sense in which they can disagree, but they're both right in that you can say, so if one company can say, our products are public. It's not that hard to learn about what we have. You can download it, you can play around with it, you can learn about it, you can read our law enforcement guide. We bend over backwards to explain all of that. And you can still be a law enforcement authority and say, that's fantastic, but there's scores or hundreds of companies out there, and they're not all as public, and they're not all as transparent, and sometimes I don't know who to call. And the most surprising piece of data in this report to me was that the single most common complaint from law enforcement authorities was they didn't know which provider to go to. And that wasn't the case when I was prosecuting crimes. To me, that's a big change, and it involves the rise of apps and the like. And that's a huge issue, which no matter how forward-leaning or cooperative any particular provider is, doesn't solve that problem by definition. And in fact, IDing the provider and getting data from the provider were more than half of the most common complaint versus issues of actually accessing or interpreting the data once you had it. And that to me is a very important insight, which doesn't get nearly as much attention in the debate as it should, and hopefully this report will elevate that problem. So having a centralized institution that can help disseminate knowledge, that can be a clearinghouse for information from different providers, that can point out how to one provider how another provider does it better, to help elevate best practices among providers, and then can go to different law enforcement agencies and say, hey, you're not alone in this problem, but here's how a fellow law enforcement agency dealt with the exact same problem. That, with no change in law other than appropriation, but Will mentioned earlier that $100 million is not that much money, so that solves that problem, right? But that's a huge low-hanging fruit, or that's a huge way to move the ball down the field without any legal change and without anybody actually compromising any of their core principles in a way that would, to my mind, vastly improve public safety.
So just on, and then I'm going to turn to David KRIS, who I see is writing furiously. But on the appropriations issue, I mean, obviously, the more money that's spent on resourcing an entity like NDCAC and ensuring that they have the resources to do the training, the better. A lot of this, though, can be done, as Will mentioned, at relatively low cost by detailing employees and by kind of rationalizing some of the grant programs that are already out there and taking the responsibility for looking at all the grant programs and thinking through how they're being funded and making sure that what funding's being made available and making sure that its funds are being spent in the most rational and effective way given the needs. So the more money, the better, but I also, as we talk about in this report, this seems like something that really is low-hanging fruit in terms of costs as well as the fact that a lot of this can be done without any changes to legal authorities at all. So I'll turn it over to David. Yeah.
I was taking notes just because I liked everything that David BITKOWER just said, and I wanted to remember it for the future. I mean, I'll just add a little bit, which I do think a centralized office would be very, very helpful, and a national policy, in part to coordinate what I think may be some duplication of effort across a whole variety of private and public sector entities that offer training of one sort or another. I think it would be worth, for example, just trying to rationalize all of that and figure out if the right resources are going to the most pressing needs. I certainly agree with what Jane said earlier about the complexity of knowing where to go when you have a complex software stack with operating systems and providers from different areas offering different apps. And so the one point I'll add that I think is worthy of some attention, I think it's a volcano waiting to erupt, is sort of not just which provider has the data, but which provider can offer up the technical assistance that may be necessary to assemble the data, to groom and normalize the data, to produce the data in some usable form. There are existing authorities across more than a dozen different provisions of federal law and many state laws in both the national security and law enforcement space, but their exact meaning and contours are extremely uncertain at this point because there just hasn't been a lot of open debate or litigation about it. I think that is an area that is worthy of attention and in need of attention, and if we don't attend to it, we're going to have some kind of crisis that will produce a messy and inefficient reaction.
Yeah, I wanted to just add a couple of other things that I thought this National Digital Evidence Center could help to serve. Companies are constantly iterating their products, improving them, changing them, releasing new products. So this center could also be a center that could be monitoring changes in digital products because it is, as we've all observed, evidence is changing every day. There's more and more digital evidence, but there's also different products and services being released. So to have a centralized place to monitor that. And then the other, as I pointed out earlier, the problem with understanding the production of the evidence, because we are consumer companies, our main customer is our customers who have our devices. So when we are producing evidence to law enforcement, it is sometimes in a form that might not be easy to understand, and to have this centralized source that can help with producing the evidence in an understandable form for law enforcement, I think would be hugely helpful.
Thanks. So, and I think that is one of the key functions that we would envision this office performing. Jane mentioned earlier, with respect to training as well, the range of things that agents need to be trained on, including preservation at the crime scene. And so I think we talk about an analogy to fingerprints in our report. We expect that every single officer across the country has basic knowledge how to preserve fingerprints. We don't expect every single officer to be able to analyze those fingerprints. And so that's kind of the model that we're suggesting here, is that training should be disseminated to deal with things like preservation of evidence at the crime scene. But there's certain knowledge bases. There's certain things that not every officer across the country can or should be expected to know, like how to interpret data that's turned over by service providers and a range of other questions. That's just that where there's really a need for specialized expertise, and centralizing that knowledge has advantages in terms of synergies and in terms of costs, and being able to provide centralized place for training to take place and for knowledge to be disseminated. Ethan, I'll turn it back to you if you have any comments on the recommendations and thoughts going forward.
I was just going to jump into this data format question because I think it's really interesting and important. We've experimented with this a little bit. So our messenger output is in JSON, JavaScript object notation format, and it's very, very difficult to parse. If you look at a sheet, it is almost impossible to find the text. We've transferred that into HTML in our productions when we produce it to law enforcement. There are costs and benefits to that. So it makes it much easier for law enforcement to read, but it also transforms it from a business record that we keep in the ordinary course of business to something that is not a business record and something that probably cannot be introduced into evidence. There's also no guarantee that there's a perfect translation between the two documents. So we will send out a warning to law enforcement indicating we have tried to translate this into a human readable format, but we cannot guarantee that all of the data has been perfectly transferred. That also creates problems for law enforcement. Obviously, law enforcement cares very much about the accuracy of the data. So it is not so straightforward about trying to decide what kind of format data is produced in. And there's also the challenge of talking to engineers and explaining to them that even though there is no business need to produce this data in this format, we have a need because law enforcement needs to see it. So these are tough questions, and I think not as straightforward as it sounds. Just producing things in human readable format creates challenges for us.
I agree with what Ethan was just saying. It is very important to us that we can show when we're trying to authenticate these records that they are in the format that would be available, that the reader would actually be seeing, because we need to be able to authenticate and say that these records really have not been changed. So it is a very complicated issue. I will say that a lot of the groups that we work with, whether it be CSIS or NDCAC or my office, we have developed parsers that work, that enable us to actually go through the data But one of the issues that we have is that we'll have that parser, it'll work for a period of time until the providers change the format. And again, that's within their right. They have a business duty, their technology is continuously growing. But when that changes, all of a sudden, we now lack the ability to actually access those records again. And so, again, having a dialogue with providers when those changes are going into place would be extremely helpful across the board. In terms of whether or not it should be in a national center, I have a little bit of concerns about that, and really need to think further through on it. But my biggest concern mostly is that, again, when you're dealing with federal agencies, they have one set of rules generally that applies across the board for the most part, unless, of course, if you're dealing with national security, they have a different set of rules, but if you're dealing with law enforcement, they generally have one set of rules. When you're dealing with the states, we have rules that differ across every single state. New York State happens to generally be more protective of consumers and of the accused than other states, and so it's very difficult to have potentially one group that would oversee all of this for the entire country, because really it's going to change and vary very greatly depending on which state that you're actually dealing with. There are some groups that are out there, in full disclosure, I am an executive advisory member on NDCAC, and so one of the things that NDCAC does, recognizing sort of the importance of this to state and locals, is that on the executive board, there's 8 state prosecutors' offices and law enforcement represented, as opposed to 7 from the federal side. And so we work through a lot of these issues and try and deal with them. In terms of sort of an advisory board, a potential solution might be having some people from the providers interacting more with sort of the executive board, and that might be a way also to address some of the ever-changing needs on both sides.
So we're going to go to questions in a moment, so start thinking about your questions, but I did your point about the differences across states and localities is an important one, and I just wanted to emphasize or clarify, in case it wasn't clear, that when we talk in the report, and we've talked about here about a national digital office and the resourcing of NDCAC to fully serve or to better serve the needs that are out there, a lot of that work we envision would be on the technical assistance side, on the training side, and recognizing that a lot of that work also would involve grant making and supporting the range of state and local entities and efforts that are already out there that are quite excellent, that are doing really important work at the local level, where that work needs to happen because of variation across different states. So just wanted to clarify that this office was intended in part to provide centralized place for dealing with some of the questions about technical expertise and interpretive tools, where we really think that having the synergies and a single place point of contact is quite useful, but also serve as a grant-making entity and helping coordinate the grant-making to all of the many important state and local entities, and also directing those who call to the appropriate state and local entities. So one of the functions that NDCAC serves is that they provide a 24/7 hotline service, which is an incredibly valuable service. But as Will mentioned previously, NDCAC's budget is around $11 million a year to do that, plus all the other functions that NDCAC is expected to do. And so one of our hopes is that a better resource, better funded NDCAC would be able to better serve the needs across the country. All right, with that, let's turn it over to your questions. Yes.
I actually have 2. So you mentioned the development of a national center to assist state and local law enforcement. In your research, were you able to find other models where state and local authorities, whether law enforcement or otherwise, were duplicating efforts nationwide, and the federal government assumed responsibility for doing something at the national level, and did that work or didn't it? And concerning technical assistance, there was some news articles about a year ago where the Federal Bureau of Investigation worked with Carnegie Mellon for technical assistance. At the state and local level, are there similar relationships with universities or other organizations that could help provide that type of technical assistance? Was that something you found in your national survey?
Sure. So, the survey didn't address those specific questions. I'm going to actually turn over some of your questions to Michael. But to be clear, I mean, and this is what I was trying to say, but maybe didn't say very effectively before. I don't think. I mean, we clearly are not suggesting that the federal entities subsume responsibility that has been in the hands of state and local state and local entities before, rather to serve as additional assistance. So NDCAC, for example, is run out of the FBI. On its board sits primarily, as Michael just mentioned, it's primarily made up of state and local law enforcement officers who sit on the board, and its mission is to serve state and locals. Its primary mission. It also serves federal entities as well. And so the idea would be to more adequately resource an entity like that already exists, and also to distribute grants and funding to the state and local entities that are effective. At the same time, recognizing that there are certain tasks that are more efficiently and effectively done in a central location, like keeping up to date on some of the changing technologies and distributing interpretive tools. But Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
There are, and certainly I can speak most in detail about my own office, but yes, we do at times engage with academic universities. We do at times engage with third parties in order to work on some of these issues, and particularly in terms of working on parsers and analytical tools and things like that. We work very closely with some of our federal partners through NDCAC. And certainly there are a number of state and local law enforcement groups out there that work on these issues as well. But again, it's hard to sometimes coordinate across every single state because what the authentication requirements are in one state are not the same in another. And so we try and we share sort of analytical tools, but in terms of like the legal process behind how you acquire certain evidence or what you need to include in a search warrant or a subpoena or a 2703D order, a lot of times that's going to vary depending upon the criminal procedure rules of the individual jurisdictions. So I will say that, yes, there are a lot of groups out there that are doing very good work in this area, but it's very difficult to have sort of a one-size-fits-all solution for every jurisdiction.
Thanks. So the report and this conversation talk a lot about the challenges that providers face given the diversity of knowledge and resources among local law enforcement across 51 more different jurisdictions here in the US. But the Cloud Act is now raises the possibility that a whole world, literally, of other law enforcement authorities coming from other constitutional traditions and backgrounds will be making requests potentially directly to providers, which could significantly increase those challenges. I understand the remit of this report really was to focus domestically and nationally, but I wonder if maybe some of the representatives from the providers could speak to how they are anticipating and thinking through what challenges they may face and what steps could be taken to address some of those challenges, maybe some lessons learned from how providers try and work with the diversity of local law enforcement authorities here as the world continues to seek more and more access to data that is stored here in the US.
One of the things that I thought as I was reading the report is absolutely applicable worldwide. I think the issues that are identified in the report are very applicable to every other jurisdiction in the world. I do run a global law enforcement team. We are doing training on a more as-demanded basis. The questions are very similar. Cloud Act will, of course, depend on comity agreements actually being executed and enforce. But I think your question is very germane, but I think the report could apply globally as well.
I would just add, we're dealing with a lot of that already, right? So we get law enforcement requests from all over the world. I also run a global law enforcement program. So those are not new challenges, but they are certainly important challenges. And as difficult as it is to stay apprised of the various state laws, taking that internationally makes it exponentially more complex. The UK will be the first. The UK's legal system looks somewhat similar to ours, so that is perhaps not the biggest challenge. But if the Cloud Act expands, and other countries with legal systems that are not similar to ours are admitted, those challenges certainly increase.
One aspect of this, and this is not in the report at all, but it's an issue that we deal with because, as I mentioned earlier, so much cybercrime is now transnational. The MLAT process is really antiquated in terms of dealing with this type of issue. I'm sure that the providers have a difficult time with all of the requests that they're actually getting from foreign countries. We work with a lot of international partners who have expressed difficulty in getting records. We work with foreign countries, and we have difficulty getting those records. And again, with the speed in which money can be transferred now through multiple jurisdictions, multiple nations, it really is a problem, again, outside the scope of what we're looking at today, but it really is an issue for law enforcement to be able to get access to records in a timely manner, in not only in the U.S. at times, but very definitely in foreign jurisdictions.
Other questions? Don't be shy. All right, so we have a few more minutes. If there are any more questions? Yeah, great.
If you're able to centralize a lot of this technical expertise in one place, what's the next step? What's the best way of getting that information to the 2,300 law enforcement agencies around the country and the individual law enforcement officers there to make sure it can be actually used?
So great question. I think that and I'll turn to the panelists as well. The idea would be that if the information's available in a central location, folks would learn and know to go there. So, we envision tiers of training, going back to the fingerprint analogy earlier. Every single officer, every single agent needs to know basic information, but there's a lot of information that is not going to be in basic training, but one thing that can be disseminated is where to go to deal with the issues that come up.
I'll just echo that and say that I think my experience is, so obviously you want to make sure you train the experts, train the everyday users. Agents and prosecutors are really good at figuring out who knows what they're talking about, and if there is one person within an agency, if there's one agency in a region, if there's one set of agencies in a particular state that is doing better and getting better results, then people figure that out really quickly. So I do think if you create that sort of center of knowledge and make it available, people will come.
Yeah, I'll just say, no matter where this centralized office is created, I'm sure there will be a knife fight in a dark alley about sort of turf and control. But one of the advantages of housing it in DOJ is that there are already mechanisms, including through OJP for grants, and part of the report here recommends some grant money, in which they already have good touch points for distributing money, and I think they could probably leverage those also to distribute knowledge.
My question goes to the discussion amongst some of the panelists about overbreadth of warrants. On the one hand, I think providers have said we see lots of overbroad warrants, and on the other hand, Mr. SACHS said how do you know how broad the warrants are? Because maybe they're not overbroad. They're, in fact, just as broad as they need to be. And if you're in the provider's shoes, how do you tell, or what criteria do you use to separate one warrant from another when they probably look on their face almost identical to each other, to decide whether one is overbroad and needs to be pushed back on and another is the court's decided what the breadth ought to be and ought to be appropriately complied with?
So I can try that one. In general, we will communicate with law enforcement agents and prosecutors. So if we get a warrant that says, give us all stored content, we will make the call back to the agent and say, look, this is really broad. What are you really looking for here? And 9 times out of 10, they will tell us. They'll say, I know it's broad. Here's what I really care about. And there will be a negotiation that takes place, and that works almost always. So I think there is this precautionary tactic to create the broadest possible warrant to cover yourself in case you haven't thought of the thing that you really want. But when those conversations take place, we find almost always that these are resolvable issues and that we can figure out what they want and get it to them.
Exactly the same answer. It's a lot of hand-holding, back and forth, talking on the phone, but it's resource intensive because we get 16,000 requests a year. So that has a tendency, as the report indicated, to delay the production of relevant data.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts on that too. This same process of back and forth occurs when a big company gets, as you know, a grand jury subpoena for all data relevant to the following investigation, and then there's a discussion of search terms and custodians and various other protocols. So this is not unique to third-party providers. The other thing is, I think increasingly, as judges become more attentive to this, you're going to see some pressure at the front end, and warrants are not going to be granted with language that says all information, relevant to this. There's going to be some narrowing at the judicial end of this thing too. So I think the incentives align to try to tailor these things at both ends.
So I'll just close out the panel by saying one thing, which is that this report kind of provides a snapshot at this moment in time. These are problems that we expect and anticipate are only going to grow when you start thinking about the Internet of Things and the increasing digitalization of just about everything we do. We strongly feel that the time to begin to address these issues is now, before as these issues continue to grow over time. Please join me in thanking our excellent panelists. We are now lucky enough to be joined by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
As you heard from Jen, we are lucky enough to be joined by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who has generously given his time to speak to us today about this report. The senator is a senior member of the Judiciary Committee and has really been a leader consistently on these issues for a number of years, so we are incredibly grateful to him for coming out today.
Thank you all for coming here. I guess there are 3 general points that I want to make. One is thank you to CSIS for its continued leadership on cyber issues. 2, thank you to the authors of this report and to CSIS for taking on this issue. And 3, a little bit about the Cloud Act as a way that our work in this general space can try to push back a little bit against some of the more authoritarian tendencies happening around the world. On CSIS's work on cyber, I was involved in the cyber policy task force, which was so ably led by Jim Lewis, and I want to thank him for that work. And I also want to thank Ethan ARENSON, one of our speakers, who was condemned to serve time as a detailee in my office during that process. And I gather from his presence here that his reputation has managed to recover from that stint. But he did great work, and I was very pleased with the result there. We worked with cybersecurity experts and with industry leaders, people bi-coastal. We used to have these like co-coastal conference calls to try to develop a serious cybersecurity agenda for then the incoming administration. Some of those recommendations we made will require new legislation, but some can be implemented by the executive branch under existing authority, and we're looking forward to seeing how well the original executive order ends up being followed and to what extent these ideas have been taken up. It was good to see the White House at the time make note of the task force's work when it rolled out its cybersecurity executive order, but I will confess I have been distressed by Homeland Security Advisor Tom Bossert's ouster by National Security Advisor John Bolton. I thought that Tom was a very credible, sincere, and extremely knowledgeable person on cybersecurity issues, and the fact that his departure was followed closely by the departure of National Security Council Cybersecurity Coordinator Rob Joyce leaves me wondering where the expertise is on this issue in the administration and who is minding the store. I hope that DOJ, following the release last week of its Cyber Digital Task Force report, will take a more active and forward-looking role. I think back to a question I asked Attorney General Sessions at one of our hearings, and he could not answer who was his cyber legislative person. So if the boss doesn't know the name of the person working on the project, obviously that project hasn't gotten much traction in the agency, and I hope that the DOJ report will stand that up. I see Lindsey Graham's office represented here, and we've been working well together in our Judiciary Crime and Terror Subcommittee, and we will actually be pursuing a hearing to look into some of these questions in August. I believe the 21st is the scheduled date. Lee's giving me the thumbs up on the 21st. So David Sanger of the New York Times likened the threat of a cyber attack to the hurricane season, something we know quite a lot about in Rhode Island. You can't for sure say where the hurricane's going to hit, and you can't for sure say when the hurricane is going to hit, but you can be pretty sure that sooner or later one is going to hit. Just last week at the Aspen Security Conference, the DNI, Dan Coates, in addition to his more famous comments, said that he is, quote, concerned about a cyber 9/11, which is a phrase that we've heard out of previous occupants of that office and other members of our intelligence and national security community. Meanwhile, the White House quietly eliminated the position of cybersecurity czar. I think that given the apparent lack both of interest and expertise in the White House, the role of Congress and the role also of CSIS becomes increasingly critical in shaping and strengthening our national cybersecurity strategy. The Center does great work in a number of policy areas, and we're here today for the launch of an important report on the challenges our law enforcement community faces when it comes to accessing digital evidence needed to pursue investigations and solve crimes. So I thank very much Professor Jennifer Daskal and Will Carter for their thorough and thoughtful work, and for calling attention to obstacles that get scarce attention up against sexy topics like encryption that take up a lot of bandwidth in academic and policymaking circles. The authors of this report are right that more routine challenges present low-hanging fruit for those of us who came to Washington seeking to solve problems. The report suggests that identifying and obtaining non-encrypted data from service providers loom large as challenges to our state and local law enforcement. To mitigate the challenges, the report recommends tangible steps for government and private sector stakeholders alike. Its call for a national digital evidence policy to be spearheaded by a national digital evidence office is a response worthy of serious consideration given the rapid proliferation and role of digital communications and data storage. As Daskal and Carter suggest, such an office could be tasked with training and equipping law enforcement agents to make effective use of legally available data and with promoting awareness and transparency about the nation's digital evidence programs and how they affect civil liberties. I am grateful for your report's recommendations, and whether it's advocating for more training and resources or encouraging service providers to step up their game, count me in. I love working with you, and this is a great new project. On the Cloud Act, the third point I wanted to touch base with you, the Senate passed this bill, fully named Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data. I don't know where the office is in the Senate that makes up these cute acronyms, but there it is. I, at one point, proposed a Secure Health Information Technology Act. Not so great on the acronym front there. Tom Bossert wrote some time ago, along with Deputy National Security Advisor Patty McGinnis, quote, "All too often, officials in one country investigating a serious crime with victims in that very same country cannot get data they need simply because it's on a server halfway across the world." The cloud legislation in the short term, in the immediate, established a framework for U.S. law enforcement to obtain emails stored on foreign cloud servers while also allowing American internet service providers to comply with requests for information from foreign governments. This was a useful framework. It was developed through lengthy negotiations with the Department of Justice and representatives from the technology sector, and it was developed in bipartisan fashion with exceptional leadership from Senator Lindsey Graham, who used our subcommittee as a vehicle for moving this forward. It has a lot of support in the private sector. Microsoft, facing a Justice Department lawsuit, has endorsed this approach. So have Apple, Facebook, and Google. At a hearing we held in the Senate committee last year, law enforcement officials, tech company executives, and foreign allies all agreed that we need these clear rules of the road that will help bring criminals and terrorists to justice, while also honoring consumers' right to privacy for their data. And that takes me to the larger perspective that I hope to use the Cloud Act as leverage for, which is that a government participating in these law enforcement exchanges must meet specific transparency requirements, rule of law criteria, and procedural protections. Countries that do not respect privacy and human rights, like China or Russia, would not get to join these data sharing agreements. In that sense, and again, despite the authoritarian currents running throughout the globe, this process puts a stake in the ground, saying to nations, your rights to access this information will depend on your transparency, your rule of law, and your civil rights and liberties. And I think that the desire of nation states to solve crimes by getting access to digital data will be a persistent force leading them in the direction of compliance with the Cloud Act, and that as they come on, they will necessarily have to meet those high standards, and that will be a larger force for good than the mere provision of the data itself. As we work to tackle the challenges of modern law enforcement, we must always strive to craft policies that are firmly rooted in the values of open and free societies. Protecting our citizens and institutions also means preserving respect for the rule of law that protects them. The work of the Center for Strategic and International Studies shows that our democratic principles are the bedrock upon which solutions to thorny problems can successfully be built. So thank you for this excellent report, for your long-standing commitment to strategic problem solving, and for this opportunity to address you today. Thank you.
And with that, I certainly cannot top the senator's words, so I won't try. Thank you all for coming out today. We hope you read the report. We hope that you like it. And if you have questions, if you have feedback, if you have words of praise, most importantly, please feel free to reach out to us. We look forward to hearing from all of you.